Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Nice having you here today. We're still having many people trying to join. So we're going to start in a couple of minutes. Nice to see familiar names that will attend today's webinar. All right, Irene, we can start and can just add meeting the people as we move along. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We're very glad to have you all today with us. We're glad to present the hot topic, understanding how ESG risk affect enterprise value. And of course, even more excited to have with us our good EIMF associate and trainer Irene Loucaides to present this topic. So the post-pandemic world, of course, see an ever greater focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And business leaders need to be aware of how ESG risk can affect, of course, their company and the registered stakeholders' priorities in this area. So on today's webinar, which is an awareness raising session, if you like, for businesses facing an evolving landscape of ESG-related risk that can impact their profitability, success, and of course, even their survival. So given the unique impacts and dependency of ESG-related risk, corporations, of course, need to better understand the full spectrum of these risks so that they manage and disclose them effectively. So before we move on, it's would be nice to introduce our presenter for today, Irene Loucaides, which is the Managing Director of Growth Sustainability Consulting. Hi, Irene. Thank you for being here with us. Irene is a social impact strategist leveraging 20 years of experience in leadership positions in both the business and civil society sectors. And Irene has worked with organizations of all sizes to maximize the impact of their sustainability strategies by communicating how these are making a difference in their business and our world. It's going to be a brief introduction about our presented. So excuse me, Irene, for this. There is a lot of business background and experience that Irene carries throughout her 20 years experience. So before we move on to the actual presentation, just to inform you that you are able to write your questions in the chat box during the webinar, of course, or at the very end. And the questions will be answered throughout the course, the session. So, Irene, there is a great interest in general for topics around ESG, as or everyone knows. There is a guide to the latest ESG regulatory initiatives, which of course includes climate benchmark regulation, sustainable finance disclosure regulation, and taxonomy regulation. Of course, today we are not going to touch this, but we are going to focus in the ESG risk and how they affect enterprise value. And I assume we will affect them, how affects also the manner in which companies operate within. So among us other within this webinar, you will be able to pinpoint the need to identify the ESG risk throughout the operations and value chains, to define ESG risk, describe the GRM framework, identify impacts and dependency, and of course, apply prioritization criteria and so more. All right, that's from my side as an introduction. Let's hear what you have to say about this. Thank you very much.
Panayoti, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone who is with us. And thank you also to the EIMF for the opportunity to speak about this hot topic, as you said, that has become really critical, especially in recent months, as the climate crisis is threatening our very existence. So I'd like to start with this video, just to set the tone. So I don't want to burst your bubble, but this is what 2022 looked like, and it definitely wasn't a pretty picture. We live in a world where we are asked to face crisis after crisis and risk after risk. The catastrophic effects of climate change, like rising temperatures that cause our natural ecosystem to have huge imbalances, the destruction of our biodiversity, extreme weather phenomena such as floods and wildfires, risks that threaten our health, like the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical instabilities that cause energy and food crises that we are now faced with as a result of the continuing war in Ukraine, inflation. All of these things pose a threat to businesses in every industry. Until now, companies mostly analyzed financial related risks, such as credit and liquidity risk. Sometimes they looked at reputation risk. In the last years, a lot of emphasis is placed on cyber risks. Companies have been considering governance risks for many years, focusing on aspects such as anti-bribery and corruption, compliance, etc. Today, businesses face an evolving landscape of ESG-related risks that can impact their profitability, their success, even their survival. ESG-related risks are very unique in the way that they impact an organization, but also the way the organization is dependent on that resource. When glaciers, for example, melt because of global warming, the sea level rises. For some islands in the Pacific Ocean, like Palau, that could mean their extinction. So if you're an investor and you get a proposal to invest in a new hotel complex in Palau, whose economy depends on tourism, what do? Do you ignore that risk? Will it influence your risk rating and score? This is the president of Palau, who during COP26 last year said, "We would rather be bombed now to death rather than suffer a slow and torturous death because of the climate change." These are the very nations that returned to COP27 this year, asking developed nations to cover the unbearable costs of the destruction that they caused. Let's have a look at another example. If you work in the dairy industry, for example, or produce some type of a food product such as ham or salami, or you have a chain of restaurants, you cannot ignore this huge mega trend called veganism that has risen in popularity because of the climate crisis, because it's considered a very good solution to the climate crisis. Scientists have proven that if we all turn vegan, we can actually reach our climate goals and keep to that 1.5 degrees Celsius. So if you work in this space and you ignore this mega trend, you could be out of business in 50 years' time. But if you reverse this risk and turn it into an opportunity by including, for example, plant-based options in your portfolio and investing in their development, then that is a very good thing, right? Each company has different ESG risks depending on its business model, its internal and external environment, product or services mix, its mission, vision, and core values. So there isn't a predetermined list of these risks. If corporations wish to ensure their business continuity in this ever-changing world and challenging ecosystem that we've just described, they must start identifying the risks that arise from this crisis in order to get better prepared for them. They need to build survival mechanisms that will make them more resilient in the future. But today, we won't only focus on the risks and the negative effects, such as the reduction in revenue or damage to reputation, but we will also have a look at the positive impacts and the opportunities, such as emerging markets for new products, cost-saving initiatives like the example that we just seen. Now, usually climate-related risks are divided into two categories, physical and transition risks. Physical risks arise from climate change itself, and transition risks from our efforts to achieve our climate objectives and reverse this crisis. Physical risks involve heat waves, floods, droughts, what we've seen in the video that I've just shown you. And transition risks involve inflation, high energy and food prices, so basically all of the issues that we're faced with today. ESG risks are now among the top risks recorded globally in terms of impact and likelihood, and that's why ESG rating systems have been developed to help investors avoid these risks. Now, in 2008, for example, there was only one societal risk, and that was pandemics, that was reported in the top 5 risks in terms of impact. 10 years later, in 2018, 4 out of the top 5 risks were environmental or societal, including extreme weather events, water crisis, natural disasters, and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Now, in the business world, this evolving landscape means that ESG-related risks that were once considered black swans are now far more common, and they can manifest more quickly and significantly. The benefits from taking a more active role in understanding and facing these risks are many. First of all, an organization's medium and long-term viability, or sustainability, if you will, and resilience will depend on the organization's ability to anticipate and respond to a complex and interconnected array of risks that threaten its strategy and objectives. Enterprise risk management identifies and assesses risks for potential impact to the strategy and business objectives. So articulating these risks in these terms brings these issues into the organization's mainstream processes and evaluations, and obtaining enough information on these ESG-related risks enables management to assess the overall resource needs and helps optimize allocation of these resources. So by considering both positive and negative aspects of ESG-related risks, management can identify trends that lead to new opportunities, such as the example we just saw with providing plant-based options. Also, managing ESG-related risks centrally and alongside other entity-level risks helps to eliminate redundancies and better allocate resources to address the entity's top risks. And last but not least, improved understanding of these risks can provide the transparency and the disclosure that investors expect now, leading to increased investor support or achieving better financing terms. ESG-related risks can be more unpredictable and manifest over a longer period of time or often an uncertain time frame. Assessment of risk is often based on historical data, but for ESG-related risks, particularly those that are new or emerging, it can be very difficult to find historical precedents to estimate the risk impact. ESG-related risks are multifaceted and interconnected, so they can affect the business on many different dimensions. So this can make assessing an ESG-related risk more complex. And also risks may be outside the organization's control. So responding to an ESG-related risk might rely on the actions of other parties, or it may require coordinated efforts.
Irene, if I may, in your previous two slides, the benefits, have the companies realized the benefits of the ESG risk assessment? And secondly, yes.
It's a rather new area. There are organizations abroad that are taking coordinated action, but very few organizations in Cyprus have already looked deeply into it. But because we are offering sustainability reporting services and materiality analysis services to some clients, this topic might come up in their materiality analysis. So organizations that are forced to report, they have to disclose what they're doing about this issue if it comes up as a highly critical material topic in their materiality analysis. So it's not something that they can avoid. And with the new CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, a lot more organizations will be forced to report. So if this issue, identifying climate-related risks, either in their own operations or their supply chain, a lot more organizations are going to be forced to look into this issue more seriously and in more depth.
Thank you, Irene, for that. What about the ESG risk? Can you give us an example of a macro or risk usually outside the entity's control? Or
actually, this is the slide that I wanted to go through. I have included some examples of ESG-related risks and opportunities. So let's have a look at them. They are divided in 4 different categories: strategic, operational, financial, and compliance. So an example could be shifting customer preferences towards products that are manufactured with ethical supply chains. And I have another example about ethical supply chains further on in the presentation as well. This is a social risk. It could be a governance as well. Depends how you look at it. Also, growing investor interest in ESG issues resulting in proxy voting against the company on a range of topics, for example, diversity, deforestation, and human rights. This covers all ESG areas: environmental, social, and governance. Then moving on to operational, increased cost of raw materials due to sustainable forestry practice requirements. This is something that we also see now because of the unrest in Ukraine. So this is an environmental issue, but it could end up being a social issue as well. This is what we see with the energy crisis and the food crisis. Reduction of waste and raw material costs through improved manufacturing processes, changing weather patterns and increased natural disasters disturbing operations and business continuity. In financial risks, reputation impacts and societal concerns due to a tax avoidance strategy and lack of tax transparency. Investment in local content to generate sustained and inclusive growth through economic diversification and employment opportunities. Increased taxation from carbon tax regulation. And lastly, for compliance, enhanced reporting requirements for greenhouse gas emissions and energy usage, and inaccurate or fraudulent disclosure of emissions resulting in fines and penalties and loss of consumer trust. So these are some examples of ESG-related risks. Obviously, there is more, and depending on the industry and the business, this could vary widely. So in order to manage ESG-related risks, monitoring external shifts in the regulatory landscape is also very important. For example, in recent years, large multinationals have been closely monitoring the legislative and enforcement efforts focused on eliminating forced labor from supply chains. Similarly, discussions with external stakeholders can reveal shifting trends and industry practices such as changing demographics and customer preferences. An organization may wish to review its culture if the organization is not embracing the actions required to address an ESG-related risk. For example, an organization that experienced a number of safety incidents or a catastrophic incident may decide to implement a safety-first culture. So many organizations have ERM structures and processes in place, and leveraging these structures and processes can support organizations to identify, to assess, and to respond to ESG-related risks. And given that these risks can be complex, as mentioned earlier, or unfamiliar, we have to develop guidance to support organizations and our clients to better understand and manage the full spectrum of these risks. So today we will go through this framework, this ERM framework, step by step, so that our attendants can better understand the process, beginning, of course, with governance. So for ESG risks, like all risks, we start with developing the right governance structure. Governance or internal oversight establishes the way in which decisions are made and how these decisions are executed. So applying ERM to ESG-related risks includes raising the board and executive management's awareness of these risks and supporting a culture of collaboration amongst those responsible for risk management of ESG issues. So assigning these roles, duties and responsibilities within the existing governance structure ensures accountability, and whoever has responsibility for each risk is called a risk owner. Now, in this table, you will see that each risk involves a different department within the organization, so the risk owner every time could be different. It doesn't mean that the risk manager decides on the action plan for every single risk. So he or she will have to collaborate closely with the risk owner, who might be the environmental officer, or it might be an HR professional. And this is what we do with all sustainability related issues, such as ESG reporting. So ESG risk management can't work in isolation. It must be considered in every single operation, and each influences each other. They are interrelated. So moving on to strategy and to goal setting, we must address the impacts that the organization has on the planet and people, but also how the organization is dependent on these two elements. So all organizations have impacts and dependencies on nature and on society, and understanding where a business's most significant impacts and dependencies on the natural world and society lie allows for the inclusion of this information into operational and strategic decisions, and can lead to a wide range of potential benefits for businesses, as well as for the environment and society. Now, let's have a look at another example. A multinational fashion retailer, for example, cooperates with a clothes factory in Bangladesh. This factory doesn't have the right health and safety protocols, for example, to protect its workers, or it doesn't provide decent working conditions and expects its workers to work 14-hour shifts and get paid peanuts. Going further back into sourcing raw materials like cotton, for example, there might be children working in the fields collecting that cotton, or during the coloring of the fabrics, chemicals are used, that whose waste is not disposed of properly, causing environmental damage in the local community, as well as the health of the workers who inhale those chemicals. Now, all of that so that you can buy your sweatshirt at the cheapest possible price. Black Friday is coming up. I'm sure you're all looking into that. And it may even have a sustainable label on it. So irresponsible communication is another issue. Now, I have mentioned 7 different social and environmental violations within that retailer supply chain that can cause the organization huge fines and damages. So when the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh collapsed, human lives were lost. Human lives cannot be compensated. So the cost of inaction is most certainly much higher than the cost of action. And this example also proves that it's not enough to assess risk only at the company level and its own operations, but the whole supply chain. And may I dare say, value chain both up and downstream, going up to how our product or our service is used and consumed by customers. Only then can an organization claim to have taken all the necessary due diligence measures to mitigate ESG risks and ensure its resilience. Sustainability is very often about culture change, and that usually requires behavior change, and that is the hardest thing to accomplish. So moving on to performance for ESG related risks. Obviously, firstly, we need to identify risk. Organizations use a lot of different approaches for identifying ESG related risks. For example, megatrend analysis, SWOT analysis, impacts and dependency mapping, stakeholder engagement, or materiality assessments, such as we mentioned before. These tools. Yes.
Is there the best way to make this assessment, or is a combination of all this you have
there
mentioned
isn't
before?
A cookie cutter structure, if you will. Each organization might choose the one that fits its own ecosystem, industry, or business, and it depends what the ESG risk owner might select, or their risk management agency uses, for example. It's not the same every time. But what is important is that applying these approaches through collaboration between risk management and sustainability practitioners. And this is the best approach because ESG practitioners know ESG issues very well, and risk management professionals know these tools very well. So bringing them together is the best solution. So applying these approaches through collaboration elevates ESG-related risks to the risk inventory and positions them for appropriate assessment and response. So that brings us to the next level, which is the assessment and the prioritization phase, where companies have limited resources. They cannot respond equally to all risks identified across the entity. For that reason, it's necessary to assess and prioritize risks. So applying ERM to ESG-related risks includes assessing risk severity in a language that management can use to prioritize risks. Leveraging ESG expertise is critical to ensure emerging or longer-term ESG-related risks and make sure that they're not ignored or discounted, but they're assessed and prioritized appropriately. And last but not least, implementation of risk responses. So how an entity responds to the identified risks will ultimately determine how effectively the organization preserves or creates value over the long term. So adopting a range of innovative and collaborative approaches that consider the source of a risk as well as the costs and benefits of each approach supports the success of these responses.
Irene, if I may
Yes.
interrupt you, we have a question and a comment in the chat box. Would you like to take it now or at the end?
I think it's better if we leave them at the end, if that's okay with you.
Okay, not a problem.
So the fourth step is the review and revision of the ERM activities that are critical to evaluating their effectiveness and modifying the approach if that's needed. Organizations can develop specific indicators to alert management of changes that need to be reflected in risk identification, assessment, and response. And this information is reported to a range of internal and external stakeholders. Applying enterprise risk management to ESG-related risks includes consulting with risk owners to identify the most appropriate information to be communicated and reported both internally and externally to support decision-making. Now, risk appetite is the type and amount of risk that an organization is willing to accept or reject in pursuit of that value that we want to create. Tolerance is defined as the boundaries of acceptable variation in performance related to achieving business objectives. And once set, risk appetite and tolerance become the boundaries for acceptable decision-making. Boards and management typically set risk appetite for the organization when considering strategy and business context, as the two are often linked. And organizations with effective ERM practices think of risk appetite and consider it in decision-making. So if an organization has an aggressive growth strategy, it may be willing to accept more risk in general. On the other hand, if an organization is already in a mature state and industry, it may be more risk averse, but willing to accept more risk in certain areas. So consideration of the organization's risk appetite is instrumental when prioritizing risks and selecting risk responses. It can support, again, deployment of resources. It can inhibit development of objectives that would exceed the risk appetite. And risk management practitioners compare the severity of a potential risk against this risk appetite. So if the severity is within their appetite, then entities typically accept or pursue the risk. If the severity is greater, then they avoid, reduce, or share that risk. This figure summarizes threat and vulnerability of disparate risks. We have, again, financial, compliance, strategic, and operational. And figure 2 shows threat and vulnerability of individual operated risks. And this analysis can be applied to any type of risk at any level of the organization without relying on quantitative assessments of likelihood. It can also be used to show the linkages between correlated risks. For example, climate change might have impact on both operational risk, for example, damage to facilities because of severe weather, and operational risk, for example, disruption in the company's supply chain. Now, reaching to risk prioritization, an organization prioritizes risks to determine the urgency required in the management response, the types of action necessary, and the level of investment in the risk report, depending on likelihood, velocity, and resilience. And once risks are identified, management should select and deploy an appropriate risk response, which may be to accept, to avoid, reduce, or share and transfer. When considering a response, the impact and probability or likelihood, as well as the severity and prioritization, should be considered along with the business context and business objectives. And it's very important to assign clear ownership for each risk response to the appropriate risk owner. The risk owner is responsible for assembling the necessary resources for designing and implementing a risk response. Precise risk identification enables the organization to discover the root cause of a risk and select the most appropriate response to that risk. And the 5 whys method helps us analyze the root cause of risks. So beginning with observation, ESG managers continue to ask why until they arrive at the root cause. For example, the safety performance at one of your facilities might be performing worse than others, presenting an increased risk to the entity and perhaps inhibiting the ability to achieve the goal of 0 accidents that the organization has set. So we ask our first why. There might be a higher level of occupational health and safety violations at the facility than other facilities. So we ask again why. Workers at that facility are not using appropriate personal protective equipment at all times. Why is that? Because workers at the facility are not being provided with appropriate personal protective equipment and training. Why? There might be no specific environmental health and safety action plan for improvement at this facility. So we ask again why. This facility was recently acquired by another organization and didn't have it didn't have the necessary due diligence processes or adequately assess the gaps existing in that entity. So this procedure helps us reach to the root of the problem. So all entities experience changes all the time in their internal and their external environments. And from these changes, new risks might arise. So new data or assessment tools may emerge, or risk responses may turn out to be not as effective in addressing or identifying a risk or an opportunity. So by establishing indicators to review these activities, entities can recognize these changes before the risks lead to a negative impact on the business strategy or their objectives, and they need to revise them accordingly. So compared to more traditional risks, ESG related risks can change or they can evolve quickly due to changing demographics or emerging scientific data or new technology. Growing stakeholder awareness and greater access to information and social media, all these have an impact on how the environment changes and how fast it changes. So in addition, the nature of some ESG related risks can make them more difficult to predict with accuracy. In particular, the onset of climate related risks. So due to these dynamic forces, organizations should continually monitor for substantial changes in the internal or external environment to determine if any of these shifts trigger a change in the risk profile and require a response or a decision from the management. So that brings me to my last slide. And I'd like to conclude with this quote: "Risk is the price you pay for opportunity." And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and time. And I welcome any questions that we have. I've seen that we've had quite a lot, actually.
Well, thank you very much, Irene, for the presentation. I'll keep your last note about the risk is the price you pay for opportunity. Let's not be the case that protecting the environment, we do not want to pay much. So we need to do our best on that. I have many questions to ask you, but let's of course give priority to our participants. If I take it from the beginning, Yana, question: could you please explain the double materiality analysis that is supposed to identify companies' risk? When asking third parties as a part of the analysis, which questions should we ask them in order to obtain a robust response?
So the double materiality concept is based on the two perspectives that an organization should take when assessing its impacts. So on the one hand, we assess what impacts the organization has on the environment and society. And on the other hand, we see how changes in the environment and society impact the organization and its value. So in a financial sense. So this is the two perspectives of the double materiality. And in the new European sustainability reporting standards that were recently announced, this double materiality approach will be compulsory for reporting organizations. So it's very important to base our sustainability strategies on this double materiality approach. Okay. What was the second part of the question? Can you remind me again?
When asking third parties as a part of the analysis, which questions should we ask them in order to obtain a robust response?
Yes, thank you for that. Very good question. It depends which framework the organization uses for its reporting or for its strategy. So if you use the GRI standards, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative standards, you can use the 34 material topics of the GRI standards. For example, now with the new European sustainability reporting standards, there is a different set of material topics. So depending on which framework or standards you use, those are the material topics you should use in your analysis. But of course, you cannot include all of them in the analysis. The organization should choose the ones that are relevant to its business and its industry. So if an issue is irrelevant to your business and your industry, you should not include it in your questionnaire or survey or the way that you use to engage with your stakeholders. So first of all, you advise with the management of the organization to eliminate these topics to the ones that you think are most relevant. And some standards provide sector-specific material topics, so they do that work for you. For example, if you work in the oil and gas industry, this list of material topics is already predetermined by the oil and gas sector-specific standards of the GRI.
Yeah, and I think we haven't answered her question, the whole perspective. Does that respond to question? I would like to know how to obtain the ESG factors risk. Again, Yana. According to the CSRD, a double materiality analysis is necessarily, and a part of it is a questionnaire for internals and externals. Yana's question is how we ask.
Covered, yes.
Yeah, of course. All right, nice. So another question comes from Rubiniana. I think it has to do with risk response implementation. What do you mean share and transfer response?
Yes. As I said, as with all risks and with all ESG related matters in general, it's not something that one person or one department is responsible for. So this issue needs a lot of collaboration, not just with risk owners, but we might choose to include other stakeholders in the way that we face this risk. This could be an NGO, it could be the local community. And this multi-stakeholder approach is the basis of sustainability. So in certain cases, we might need to include other stakeholders in the way that we deal with this risk. I'll give you an example. It's an example that I very often use. It's about washing detergent. For example, P&G saw, after a very detailed analysis that they did, that whatever changes they did in their factories, in their products, in the way they designed their packaging, emissions were the highest from the consumer's point of view. So what they did is launch this huge campaign about washing our clothes with cold water, wash cold, at 30 degrees, for example, rather than 60 or 90 degrees like our grandmothers used to do, because that would be the way to reduce emissions the most within their whole value chain. So even if an organization does whatever it can within its own powers, of course, to improve its processes and reduce these risks, if we don't have collaboration from the whole supply chain and the value chain, then there's so much we can do. So this collaborative approach and spirit is what we need with all sustainability and ESG related issues. I hope I've answered the question.
Okay, thank you very much. What about are risk practitioners well equipped to handle the task of ESG risk management, or should ESG consultants be engaged in this process, let's say?
So as I've said before, the best is to have a risk expert working closely with an ESG expert. Risk experts know the ERM framework and they know risk assessment tools very well, but they're not very familiar with ESG risks, at least not yet. So working together, they complete each other's knowledge and expertise to produce the best results. And that's what we suggest as the best approach.
And what about when should the company engage in this exercise in terms of its ESG maturity level?
So risk management usually falls under the corporate governance pillar. But before we embark in this exercise, there are many other steps that an organization must take towards sustainability, beginning with its sustainability governance. A sustainability governance structure should be set up both at board level and at working group level. The team should then be trained on ESG issues, and then it must carry out the materiality analysis through stakeholder engagement. And this is something that we touched on in the previous question. So through this process, material sustainability issues are identified. And these are the issues that we should focus on during the ESG risk management process. A company can't do everything. So through this dialogue with its most important stakeholders, it will be able to determine what issues to focus on during the ESG strategy development phase.
Right. And ESG risk management is a regulatory requirement?
I referred to the ESRS before, the new European Sustainability Reporting Standards under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is divided into 4 main areas. The 4th area is the G, that stands for governance, and this has two sub-areas that are called governance, risk management and internal control, and business conduct. So the ESRS consists of 137 disclosure requirements in total. And in addition to purely quantitative questions, they also include, they want to see information related to strategy, to risks, opportunities and impacts, and materiality characteristics. And also the GRI standards are also based on the principle of identifying actual and potential impacts, some of which are risks. So whoever uses these standards or plans to use them in the near future must provide these disclosures in their reporting, at least to some extent.
I don't know if we have mentioned this before, but how well do high ESG scoring firms manage business and operational risk?
Sorry, come again?
Yes, how well do high ESG scoring firms manage business and operational risk? I mean, when they are doing their risk assessment.
I'm not very familiar with how ESG risk scores go, so I cannot go into a lot of detail. I'm sorry about that.
No. Okay,
but
okay.
I can have a look at it and share some information later on.
Of course. So I don't know if we have any other questions. I will have again from Rupiana. And not to see the question. Okay, is the ESRF realistic for a company to undertake?
What is the ESRF?
Rupiana, is ESRF realistic for a company to undertake?
If she can, I'm not sure what the initials mean, if she can give us some more information.
Right. Did we have a reply from Rubiana about the acronyms ECRF? Yana has another question. Could you precise? Okay, it's Rubiana. You mentioned 147 disclosure requirements. Okay, it's not a full comment or whatever. So Yana is asking, could you precise where we can find the GRI risk? Except of
there is no GRI risk, but you can find the GRI standards. They are free of charge, and anyone can access them from the GRI website. So the standards are openly available to everyone.
Okay, we're close to end this webinar. It's good to have all the team until the end of the webinar, and this is shows that there is a great interest on this issue, and of course in ESG in general. So, any final remarks, closing remarks, Irene, from your side before we close?
Just that it's a fascinating topic, and I constantly keep reading about it and doing research on it. So it's a fascinating topic, and I would urge participants to also look into it if they're interested, and get in touch if they would like more information, either about ESG risk management or sustainability in general. We'll be happy to hear from them.
Right. So thank you very much. I would add that employers want to work with employees want to work with companies with purposes aligned to their own priorities. So it is understood that firms with strong ESG credentials, let's say, are increasingly able to attract and retain the best talent. Of course, consumers sees that, investors also are increasingly influenced by ESG factors. So yes, we're going to see many more, I guess, in the near future, more initiatives. So I would like to thank everyone for being here, for attending. Irene, thank you very much for the presentation, for the insights, for the input.
Thank you for having me.
And looking forward for the next webinar to give more information on other related topics. So thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon,
nice evening
everyone.
to everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.